In this video, I will cover the rest of the built-in functions that we can use with list boxes. I will start with count. Count is a built-in function that counts the number of items you have inside of a list box. Here's the general format on how to use that function, and here is an example of how to use that function to count the number of items you have in a certain list box. Since count always returns an integer, you have to define a variable of data type integer. In this case, int count will be assigned number 7 because this is the number of items I have in this list box. Here's an example of an application where I already programmed the button count, and here's the code for that button. So when I click that, the compiler is going to go to the list box and count how many items. So when I click this button, I expect to see number 7 displayed in the output box. Contains is another function that we can use when dealing with list boxes. Contains is a function that looks for a certain item inside your list box. If the item is found, it will return true. If the item is not found in your list box, it will return false. Here's the general format on how to use contains in your application. Here is an example on how to use the function contains in your application and in your code. I will show you two methods on how to use that function in your application. The first method, I'm going to define a variable of type boolean. Since the function always returns either true or false, I'm going to assign the value to the function. So in this case, the function is going to go look for this name, Gary, and see if it exists in the list. In this case, it does exist. So this function will return the value true, which will be assigned to BLN found. Then I'm going to use that variable in order for me to test whether the condition is met or not. In this case, BLN found equals true. So I will show the user this output. The name is found in the list of students. The second method, I'm going to send the output directly to the user. So I want the user to see the word true or false when he or she is looking for a certain name. So in this case, I assigned lbl output.text to the function. So the function is going to go look for this name in the list box. As you can see, this name doesn't exist in the list box. So this will return the value false. So the user will see the output, the actual word false. If I were looking for another name, Nancy, for example, since that name exists in the list, the user will see the word true as an output. Here's an example of an application that is using these two methods that I just explained. So the first button contains 1. It's going to run this code. So it's going to go and look for this name since Gary already exists in the list box. This condition has been met and we see this output. The second button contains 2. Would run this part of the application, and as you notice, I have only one of them. The other one, I have it as a comment. So when I look for the name Jordan, the output will change to false because the name Jordan doesn't exist in my list box. If I switched and I made the first one a comment and I start searching my list box for this name, the user is going to see the output true because the name Nancy exists in this list box. The third function we're going to be talking about is indexing. Indexing is a function that uses an integer and uses that as an index number and will return the item inside that index. Here's the general format on how to use that function in your application and your code. Here is an example of how to use that function in your application. Remember that indexing always returns an item. So when you're defining a data type, you need to make sure that you are defining a data type that is consistent with the items that you have inside of your list. In this case, the items I have in my LST class names are names, so I'm defining str names as data type string. I'm going to assign it to the function where it's going to go to index 6, and it's going to return the item inside that index, which is the name Kate. Then I'm going to send the output str name, so the user is going to see Kate as the output. Here's an example of an application using the same code that I just explained. So the button indexing have this part of the code that will be executed. So when I click that, the compiler will go and find the item at index 6, which is the name Kate. It will be assigned to str name, then that will be displayed to the user in LBL output. The fourth function that we'll be talking about is the function add. Add simply adds new items to the list at runtime. Here's the general format on how you can use the function add. So you start with the list name, items, add, then the item that you want to add to the list box. Here's an example of how we're going to add two names at runtime to my list, LST class names. So the first name I'm going to add is Jordan, followed by adding the name Sophia. When you are using add always going to add a new list item to the end or the bottom of the list. So Jordan will be added right after Kate. So you can see here LST class names before running the two lines of code. Kate was the last name inside the list in the list box, but after adding Jordan and Sophia, now they were added at the bottom of the list. Here's an application that's going to run the same code that I just showed. When I click add, the compiler is going to go and run these two lines of code. So when I add them, you notice that Visual Basic immediately added the scroll down menu, and Jordan and Sophia were added to the list box, and they were added at the bottom of the already existing list box. The fifth function we'll be talking about is insert. Insert works in the same manner as add. However, with insert you can add a new item at runtime to the list box, but you can add it at a specific location. So you can specifically put items in specific locations. Here's the general format, how to use this function in your application and your code. The first value is going to be the number, and that will be used as the index number. The second value is going to be the item that you want to add to the list. Here's an example of how can I use insert in my code and in my application. So in this case, I want to add this name, Jordan, to my list LST class names, and I want this name to appear at index 2. So the compiler is going to go to the index part. It's going to go to index 2. It's going to push all the names down, and it's going to add that name in that index. So now all these names shifted down by one index. So here's an application that again gonna run the same line of code that I just showed. I'm gonna click the button add again just to show you the difference. So with add, it's gonna add the names to the bottom of the list. With insert, it's gonna go to index 2 and it's gonna add Jordan or this name or item at this location. So now it added that name in that location, pushing all the other items downward. The sixth function we're going to talk about is the function remove. And this function, you can identify an item and you can remove it from the list box at runtime. This is the general format of how you can use remove in your application. Here is an example on how you can use the function remove in your application. One thing about the function remove, it's only going to remove one instance of that item. So in this case, it's going to go and search the list box, searching for this item. Once it finds the first match, it's going to remove that. It's not going to continue looking for other matches. So if I have different students with the exact same name, it will only remove one of these names. Here's an application where I'm going to use the function remove. When I click the button, this is the part of the code that will be running. The compiler is going to go look for this name in my list box and delete that. For the sake of the argument, just to show you an example, I added another 3 exact same names. So when I click remove, it will only going to remove the first instant of it. So when I click remove, it only removed the first time. The other 3 names are still there. So when I click it again, it's going to delete this name. So now I still have 2 other names. The 7th function we're going to talk about is removeat, and it works the same way that the remove function works. However, with removeat, instead of identifying the item, I'm going to only include the index number. So I'm going to include the index number, and the compiler is going to go to that index and delete the item inside that index. Here's an example of how we can use removeat in our application. So in this case, I'm going to remove the item at index 1. So the compiler is going to go to the index. It's going to find index 1. In this case, it's going to remove the name James from my list. And this is how my list is going to look like after I remove the name James. Here's an example of an application that we're going to use removeat. When I click that button, this is the part of the application that's going to be running. So the compiler is going to go to index 1 and it's going to remove the name at that index. In this case, it's going to be James. So if I click removeat, James will be removed from the list. If I clicked it again, the compiler again is going to go to index 1. So in this case, it's going to be Odai. And if you continue clicking, it's going to remove any name that is in that location. You notice at this point, now I have only one name in the list. So if I click removeat, it's going to show me a runtime error because you are trying to remove an item that does not exist. The final function that we'll be talking about is clear. Clear will delete all the items in the list at runtime. This is the general format on how you can use clear in your application. Here's an example on how you can use clear. So the list box name, items, clear. This will delete all the items. So here's my list box before, and here's after the function is executed. Here's an application that is using clear function. So when I click this button, this is the part of the code that will be executed. When I click that, it removed all of the items from my list.